Sam, an adventurous hiker, had always sought out the most remote and untouched places to explore. One day, he came across a secluded area deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place locals had warned him about. Known as Whispering Pines, this stretch of forest had a reputation for strange occurrences. Some said that the woods held an ancient curse, but Sam was unfazed. The first day was uneventful. Sam set up camp by a small creek, the sound of water soothing his nerves. The air was fresh, and the tall pines provided ample shade. But as dusk settled in, an unsettling feeling began to wash over him. The trees seemed to close in, the forest unnaturally silent. Suddenly, a distant echo reached his ears, faint at first but growing louder. It sounded like a woman crying for help. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the wind, but the sound persisted. Sam's heart began to race as he debated whether to venture deeper into the woods to find the source. Every horror story he had ever heard about these woods came rushing back, but his curiosity won. Grabbing a flashlight, he began walking toward the sound. Each step felt heavier than the last, the trees seeming to shift as if they were watching him. And then, without warning, the cries stopped. Sam continued deeper into the forest, despite the eerie silence that had now replaced the cries for help. The darkness of night enveloped him, and the only light came from his flickering flashlight. His instincts told him to turn back, but something pulled him forward, a need to understand what was out there. After what felt like hours of walking, he stumbled upon something strange, a set of footprints. They were fresh and led off the beaten path. Sam hesitated, but decided to follow them, hoping they would lead him to whoever had cried out. But after just a few steps, the footprints abruptly stopped. Confused, Sam looked around, shining his flashlight in every direction, but there were no signs of anyone. It was as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. His heart pounded in his chest as the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice, a woman's voice. She was calling his name. Sam froze, his blood turning to ice. How could she know his name? Terrified but determined to find answers, Sam quickened his pace, following the sound of the voice. His flashlight flickered and then died, plunging him into darkness. Panicking, he fumbled to get it working again, but the beam remained dim and unstable. As he pressed on, Sam noticed a faint glow ahead, the light of a fire. Relief washed over him. Perhaps there were other campers nearby. He stumbled toward the light, his breath catching in his throat as he approached what appeared to be a campsite. The fire flickered in the middle of a clearing, but no one was there. Tents stood abandoned, backpacks lay scattered, and the remnants of a meal sat untouched. It was as if the campers had left in a hurry. A strange uneasiness settled over Sam. Something was very wrong here. He called out, but only his own voice echoed back to him. Suddenly, the woman's voice returned, closer now, whispering his name from behind him. Sam spun around, but there was nothing there, only trees swaying in the cold wind. Determined not to let fear get the best of him, Sam searched the campsite for clues. That's when he noticed something etched into the trees surrounding the clearing. Strange ancient symbols that he couldn't decipher. They looked like they had been carved into the bark long ago, but the shapes were still sharp and menacing. As he examined one of the carvings, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The world seemed to tilt, and for a moment, he could hear the faint sound of chanting, like an ancient ritual being performed deep within the forest. His vision blurred, and the trees around him seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Sam stumbled back, his heart racing. The carvings felt alive. He had heard stories of Native American legends, of ancient spirits that roamed these woods long before settlers arrived. Had he stumbled into sacred ground? Were the voices he had heard not human at all? Suddenly the air grew colder, and the whispering began again. Not just one voice this time, but many, all around him. Their words unintelligible but filled with malice. He could feel them closing in, watching him from the shadows. With panic setting in, Sam backed away from the clearing, his mind racing. He needed to leave, to get back to his camp and out of these cursed woods. But no matter how far he walked, the trees seemed endless, the path winding deeper and deeper into darkness. As he wandered, his flashlight finally gave out. plunging him into complete blackness. His phone had no signal, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Every now and then, he caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows darting between the trees, always just out of reach. Then, without warning, Sam collapsed to the ground. His head throbbed, and his vision blurred as he felt the presence of something dark and ancient surrounding him. In his delirium, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. A woman, her face obscured by shadows. She beckoned to him, her voice soft and alluring. But when Sam tried to move, he found he couldn't. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The vision of the woman faded, but the terror remained. Sam tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, his body weighed down by an unseen force. As he lay there, helpless, he heard the whispering voices again, growing louder and more insistent. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. What was happening? Was he going insane? The woods seemed to twist and shift around him, like they were alive, trapping him in their depths. Just as he thought he might lose his grip on reality, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and in that moment, Sam realized he wasn't alone. A cold hand brushed against his shoulder, and a voice, the same voice that had been haunting him, whispered in his ear, "You shouldn't have come." Summoning all his strength, Sam broke free from the paralysis and scrambled to his feet. He ran, not caring where he was going, just desperate to get away from whatever was lurking in the woods. The trees seemed to reach out for him, their branches scratching at his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, after what felt like hours, Sam burst through the tree line and into a clearing. His camp was in sight. Relief washed over him as he stumbled toward his tent, gasping for breath. But as he reached the campsite, he froze. Everything was gone. His tent, his gear, everything. It was as if he had never been there at all. The fire pit was cold, and the ground was undisturbed. Had he imagined it all? Was it all just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Before he could make sense of it, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the woman from his vision, her face pale and expressionless. She smiled, a chilling grin that sent shivers down Sam's spine, and then she disappeared into the night. Days later, Sam was found wandering the edge of the forest, disoriented and confused. He couldn't remember how he had escaped or what had happened in the woods. The locals who found him said he was lucky to be alive. Not many who ventured into Whispering Pines ever made it out. As Sam recovered, he tried to put the experience behind him, but the memories of that night haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face, heard the whispers, and felt the cold grip of something ancient and evil lurking just beyond the trees. The forest had let him go, but Sam knew it wasn't over. Whispering Pines wasn't just a place, it was alive. A dark entity that fed on the souls of those who dared enter. And though he had escaped, a part of him would always remain in those cursed woods, lost forever in the echoes of the past. Jessica and Mark had just purchased their dream home in the quiet suburbs. It was an old, charming two-story house with a big backyard and a spacious attic. The couple had saved for years to afford the house, and moving day was filled with excitement. As they unpacked, Jessica couldn't shake the odd feeling she had as she wandered through the rooms. The house was in great condition, but there was something about the attic that made her uneasy. Every time she passed the door leading up to it, she felt a chill run down her spine. She brushed it off as nerves from the move. Later that evening, as the sun set and the house settled into darkness, the couple sat down for dinner. The atmosphere was peaceful, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the neighborhood filling the air. But then, just as they were finishing their meal, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. Jessica froze, her fork hovering in midair. "Did you hear that?" she asked Mark. He nodded, his brow furrowed. It sounded like it came from the attic. They exchanged uneasy glances before Mark stood up, determined to check it out. Grabbing a flashlight, he made his way up the narrow staircase that led to the attic. Jessica followed closely behind. As Mark pushed open the attic door, the temperature dropped noticeably, and a musty smell filled the air. The attic was mostly empty, except for a few old boxes and a broken chair in the corner. But there was no sign of what had caused the noise. Mark shrugged it off. but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. Over the next few days, Jessica tried to settle into the new house, but the strange noises from the attic continued. Every night, just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she would hear faint footsteps above their bedroom. It was always the same, slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the attic. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but the noises grew louder and more frequent. One night, the footsteps were so loud that they woke both Jessica and Mark. They lay in bed, frozen with fear, listening as the sound of footsteps moved across the ceiling. "I'm going up there," Mark whispered, throwing back the covers. Jessica grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Don't, please. What if it's something else?" Mark hesitated, but eventually relented. Instead, they decided to call a professional to check the attic the next day, thinking maybe there were animals or something trapped up there. But when the pest control worker arrived and inspected the space, he found nothing. No signs of animals, no holes, no reason for the noises. Jessica's unease deepened. If there was nothing in the attic, then what was making the sound? A week later, things took a darker turn. Jessica was getting ready for bed, brushing her hair in front of the large antique mirror they had placed in their bedroom. As she ran the brush through her hair, she saw a flicker of movement in the reflection, something dark and shadowy darting behind her. She whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there. Mark, already half asleep, mumbled something about her being jumpy and told her to relax. But Jessica couldn't shake the image of the shadow in the mirror. Over the next few days, she began to notice the shadow more frequently. It was always in her peripheral vision, just a dark blur that disappeared as soon as she turned to look. It made her feel as though she was being watched, followed. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she felt a cold breeze brush against her skin. The windows were closed, but the air in the room felt icy. Jessica turned toward the mirror and froze. There, standing just behind her reflection, was the shadow. This time, it didn't disappear when she looked. It stayed there, looming over her, its form tall and faceless. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. All she could do was stare as the shadow leaned closer to her reflection, as if trying to step out of the mirror and into the room. Determined to figure out what was going on, Jessica began researching the history of the house. She discovered that it had been built in the early 1900s and had changed hands many times over the years. There were rumors about one of the previous owners, a recluse who had died under mysterious circumstances in the attic. Jessica's fear grew as she read more. The man had been found dead, sitting in the very same chair that now stood in the attic. Locals claimed that his spirit had never left the house, that he was trapped in the attic watching anyone who dared move in. That night, Jessica and Mark decided to confront whatever was haunting them. Armed with flashlights and a sense of dread, they climbed the stairs to the attic one final time. As they reached the top, the door to the attic creaked open on its own. The air inside was even colder than before, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. Mark stepped forward, his flashlight flickering. He pointed it toward the corner where the chair stood, and for a moment, Jessica thought she saw the outline of a figure sitting in it. But when the light hit the chair directly, it was empty. Jessica's stomach dropped as she realized that the shadowy figure wasn't in the chair. It was standing right behind them. After that night, the haunting became unbearable. The footsteps in the attic were constant, louder than ever before, as if something was stomping through the space. The shadow figure appeared in every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even the screen of Jessica's phone. It followed her everywhere, a constant looming presence. One night, Jessica awoke to the feeling of icy hands gripping her ankles. She screamed, kicking at the invisible force, but there was nothing there. Mark tried to calm her down, but he was starting to see the shadows too. Desperate for help, they contacted a paranormal investigator, hoping to find a way to rid the house of the spirit. The investigator, an older woman named Martha, arrived with her equipment and a calm demeanor. As soon as she stepped into the house, her face grew serious. "There's something dark here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha set up cameras and recording devices throughout the house, focusing on the attic and the bedroom, where the shadow had appeared most frequently. As she began her investigation, the temperature in the house plummeted, and the lights flickered ominously. Martha conducted a seance in the attic, hoping to communicate with the spirit. Jessica and Mark sat in a circle with her, holding hands as she called out to whatever was haunting them. The air grew thick with tension, and the shadows in the attic seemed to pulse and writhe. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment they saw it. The shadow figure standing in the corner, watching them. Martha's voice trembled as she demanded the spirit reveal itself. The figure didn't move, but its presence grew stronger, more oppressive. Jessica could feel it pressing down on her, suffocating her with its cold, dark energy. Just as she thought she might pass out, Martha threw a handful of salt into the air and shouted something in a language Jessica didn't understand. The shadow recoiled, retreating into the darkest corner of the attic. The temperature rose slightly, and the oppressive feeling lifted. But the shadow didn't disappear completely. It lingered, waiting. Martha turned to Jessica and Mark, her face pale. "It's not gone," she said quietly. "It's bound to this house. You need to leave." Jessica and Mark didn't waste any time. They packed their belongings and moved out of the house the very next day. But even as they drove away, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still watching them. The new owners of the house reported similar disturbances within weeks of moving in. Footsteps in the attic, shadows in the mirrors, and the constant feeling of being watched. The haunting hadn't ended. It had only just begun. It all started when Lauren and her family moved into a cozy house on a quiet suburban street. The neighborhood seemed perfect. The lawns were well maintained, the houses were neatly lined up, and everything had a peaceful vibe. Lauren and her husband, Alex, felt like they had found the perfect place to raise their children. But one thing stood out about the neighborhood: the house next door. Unlike the others, it was a bit run down, with chipped paint and overgrown bushes. The blinds were always drawn, and no one ever seemed to come or go. It was a mystery to everyone on the block. Despite the condition of the house, it seemed occupied. Every now and then, Lauren would catch a glimpse of a figure moving behind the curtains or hear the sound of footsteps from within. She asked around the neighborhood about the owner, but no one seemed to know much. "That house has been like that for years," one neighbor told her. "Whoever lives there keeps to themselves." Curiosity got the best of Lauren, and she decided to introduce herself. One afternoon, she baked a batch of cookies and walked over to the house. She knocked on the door and waited, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but still no one came. Disappointed, she turned to leave. But just as she reached the end of the driveway, she heard the door creak open behind her. Turning around, Lauren saw a woman standing in the doorway. She looked frail and tired, with dark circles under her eyes and pale skin. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lauren smiled and held up the plate of cookies. "Hi, I'm your new neighbor, Lauren. I just wanted to say hello and bring you these." The woman stared at the cookies for a moment before glancing back into the house. "Thank you," she said softly, taking the plate from Lauren's hands. "But you shouldn't have come." Without another word, she closed the door, leaving Lauren standing on the porch, confused. Over the next few weeks, Lauren noticed something strange. The woman in the house next door seemed to have disappeared. The blinds remained drawn, and there were no signs of life from inside. No lights, no movement, nothing. Lauren's initial curiosity turned into concern. Was the woman okay? She mentioned it to Alex, but he shrugged it off. "Maybe she's just a recluse," he suggested. "Some people like their privacy." But Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She began keeping an eye on the house, watching for any signs of activity. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was nothing. It was as if the woman had vanished. One evening, Lauren was sitting on the porch, sipping her tea, when she noticed something odd. The light in the woman's house flickered on for a brief moment before going dark again. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but Lauren was certain she had seen it. Her heart raced as she stood up and walked to the edge of her yard, staring at the house. The light flickered again, this time staying on for a few seconds longer. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it went out again. Lauren's mind raced with possibilities. Was someone in the house? Was the woman in trouble? She decided to call the police and ask for a welfare check. The officers arrived within minutes, but after knocking on the door and getting no response, they left, assuring Lauren that there was nothing to worry about. But Lauren knew better. Something was terribly wrong. After the police visit, things only got stranger. Lauren began hearing noises coming from the house next door, soft whispers, the sound of footsteps, and sometimes even the faint sound of crying. It always happened late at night, when the rest of the neighborhood was quiet. One night, Lauren was lying in bed when she heard a loud thud from the direction of the neighbor's house. She shot up, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited, listening for any more sounds, but all was silent. She nudged Alex awake, but he brushed it off as a bad dream and went back to sleep. Determined to figure out what was going on, Lauren grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. She walked around the house, peeking through the windows, but she couldn't see anything inside. The blinds were tightly shut, and the house was eerily still. As she walked around to the backyard, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She felt like someone was watching her. Slowly, she turned around, shining her flashlight toward the house, and there in the upstairs window she saw her neighbor. The woman was standing in the window, staring down at Lauren with wide, unblinking eyes. Her face was pale and gaunt, her expression vacant. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen, unable to move. Then, without warning, the woman vanished from the window, disappearing into the darkness of the house. Lauren's heart raced as she stumbled back toward her own home, her mind racing with questions. What had she just seen? Was the woman alive or something else entirely? That night, Lauren had a vivid, terrifying dream. She was standing in her neighbor's house, the air thick with a heavy sense of dread. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the darkness felt suffocating. In the dream, she wandered through the house, searching for the woman she had seen in the window. As she climbed the stairs to the second floor, she felt a presence behind her. She turned around, but no one was there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she continued up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. The air grew colder with each step, and the sense of being watched intensified. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw the woman again. This time she was standing at the end of the hallway, her back turned to Lauren. Her long hair hung limply over her shoulders, and her body was unnaturally still. Lauren called out to her, but the woman didn't respond. Slowly, she began to approach, her heart racing with fear. As she reached out to touch the woman's shoulder, the figure suddenly turned around, her face twisted into a grotesque, snarling expression. Her eyes were black, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Lauren screamed and jolted awake, drenched in sweat. Her heart was pounding and her mind was racing with fear. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that she could still feel the cold air of the house and the presence of the woman. But when she looked out the window at the house next door, everything was still. The blinds were closed, and the house was silent. Lauren tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just a nightmare. But deep down, she knew there was something more. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Lauren began digging into the history of the house next door. She searched online, looking for any records or information about the previous owners. After hours of searching, she stumbled upon an old article from the local newspaper. The house had once belonged to a woman named Margaret Turner, who had lived there with her daughter Emily. According to the article, Margaret had been a recluse, rarely leaving the house or interacting with her neighbors. Then one day, both Margaret and Emily disappeared without a trace. The police conducted a thorough investigation, but no bodies were ever found, and the case went cold. Lauren's blood ran cold as she read the article. Could the woman she had seen be Margaret? And if so, what had happened to her and her daughter? As she dug deeper, she found more unsettling details. Neighbors had reported strange occurrences in the house after the disappearance. Lights flickering on and off, strange noises, and sightings of a woman in the windows. Some believed the house was haunted, but others dismissed it as rumors. Lauren's mind raced with possibilities. Was the woman she had seen Margaret's ghost? Or was something more sinister at play? One night, unable to take the tension any longer, Lauren decided to confront the woman once and for all. She waited until Alex and the kids were asleep, then grabbed her flashlight and headed next door. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no answer, but Lauren wasn't deterred. She tried the doorknob, and to her surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, silent interior of the house. Lauren stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the house felt colder than it should have been. She made her way through the living room and up the stairs, her heart racing with every step. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw the woman again, standing at the end of the hallway. This time there was no doubt in Lauren's mind. This was Margaret Turner. Her heart pounded as she approached, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Who are you?" Lauren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned around slowly, her eyes dark and empty. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as the temperature in the room dropped even lower. Without warning, the woman lunged toward Lauren, her face twisted in anger. Lauren screamed and stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. In the darkness, she felt a cold hand grip her arm, pulling her toward the edge of the stairs. Lauren fought with all her strength, struggling to break free from the icy grip. Her heart pounded in her chest as she kicked and thrashed, desperate to escape. The woman's grip tightened, and Lauren felt herself being pulled closer to the edge of the stairs. With a final burst of strength, Lauren managed to wrench her arm free. She scrambled to her feet and bolted down the stairs, her heart racing with fear. Behind her, she heard the woman's footsteps, fast and heavy, echoing through the house. Lauren reached the front door and threw it open, racing outside into the cool night air. She didn't stop running until she was safely inside her own house, the door locked behind her. For a moment she stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to catch her breath. She glanced out the window at the house next door, half expecting to see the woman standing in the window. But the house was dark and silent, shaken and terrified. Lauren knew she had to do something. She couldn't live next to this haunted house any longer. But what could she do? The police hadn't believed her before, and she doubted they would now. The next morning, Lauren decided to call a local paranormal investigator. She explained everything that had happened, and the investigator agreed to come and take a look at the house. When the investigator arrived, he immediately sensed a strong presence in the house. He set up his equipment and began walking through the rooms, taking readings and trying to communicate with the spirit. As they reached the second floor, the investigator's equipment began to beep wildly. "There's something here," he said, his voice tense. "Something strong." Lauren's heart raced as the investigator made his way to the end of the hallway, where the woman had always appeared. He paused for a moment, then knelt down and began examining the floor. "What is it?" Lauren asked, her voice trembling. The investigator looked up at her, his face pale. "There's something buried here." Lauren's blood ran cold as the investigator began to dig. After a few minutes, he uncovered a small, dusty box. Inside, they found a collection of old photos and letters, all belonging to Margaret Turner and her daughter, Emily. But that wasn't all they found. Beneath the box, they uncovered a hidden compartment in the floor, and inside that compartment, they found the remains of two bodies. Margaret and Emily Turner had never left the house. They had been murdered and buried in their own home, their spirits trapped there for all these years. As Lauren stared at the remains, she felt a sense of overwhelming sadness. The mystery had been solved, but the horror of what had happened in that house would stay with her forever. After years of saving, Mark and Sarah finally bought their dream home in the countryside. It was a beautiful Victorian house, full of character, with tall windows and intricate woodwork. As they unpacked their belongings, they were filled with excitement and hope for their new life. But the first night brought an unsettling feeling. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, whispering secrets in the dark. Sarah brushed it off as the sounds of an old home settling. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, they both lay awake, listening to the rustling sounds coming from the corners of their new home. The next morning, as they explored the house, Sarah discovered a dusty old journal hidden in the attic. The journal belonged to a woman named Clara, who had lived there decades ago. As Sarah read through its pages, she learned of Clara's life, filled with love and laughter, but also of a growing darkness that seemed to envelop the house. "I think this journal might explain the weird noises," Sarah said, her voice filled with curiosity. Mark glanced at the journal skeptically but didn't say anything. Little did they know the shadows in the house had begun to stir. As days passed, strange occurrences began to escalate. Objects would shift positions overnight, doors would creak open on their own, and shadows flitted just out of sight. One evening, Mark was in the living room when he felt a cold breeze wash over him, chilling him to the bone. He turned to see a dark figure standing in the doorway, but when he blinked, it vanished. "Did you see that?" he asked Sarah, his voice shaky. "See what?" she replied, glancing over her shoulder. Mark shook his head, wondering if he was imagining things. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Sarah heard whispers echoing through the walls. "Help us! Help us!" The voice was faint but haunting. She tried to wake Mark, but he was fast asleep, oblivious to the growing tension. The following day, Sarah decided to investigate Clara's journal further. She found entries detailing the woman's descent into madness, filled with eerie descriptions of the house's whispers and shadows. Clara wrote about feeling watched, about voices begging for release. As Sarah read, she felt a chill creep up her spine. As the whispers grew louder, Mark and Sarah became increasingly paranoid. They started avoiding certain areas of the house that felt colder, darker. One night, Sarah woke up to see the dark figure standing at the foot of their bed, its features obscured by shadows. She gasped, waking Mark, but when he turned on the light, there was nothing there. "Are you sure you're not just dreaming?" he asked, trying to comfort her. "I know what I saw," Sarah insisted, her voice trembling. Determined to confront whatever was haunting their home, Sarah suggested they hold a seance. Mark was hesitant, but he agreed, wanting to support her. They set up a small table in the living room, lit candles, and placed Clara's journal in the center. As they began to speak, the air grew heavy. The candles flickered and the whispers returned, now more insistent. "Help us. We need to be free." Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the table shook. Mark jumped back, but Sarah remained focused, trying to connect with the spirits. "What do you want?" she called out, her voice steady. The shadows danced around them, coiling and twisting. "Release us." The voice was louder now, echoing through the room. Fear surged through Mark as he looked at Sarah, but she was entranced. After the seance, Sarah became obsessed with uncovering the truth about Clara and the house. She spent hours in the attic, poring over the journal and researching online. Mark, on the other hand, grew increasingly anxious, feeling the weight of the shadows pressing down on him. One night, Sarah found an old newspaper article detailing a tragic fire that had consumed the house decades ago, claiming the lives of Clara and her family. The article mentioned whispers heard in the aftermath, describing a dark force that had taken residence in the home. "Mark, you have to see this," she exclaimed, holding up the article. But when he glanced at it, he felt a wave of dread wash over him. "Maybe we should just leave this place," he suggested. "Leave? This is our home," Sarah replied fiercely. "I need to understand what happened here." As the days turned into nights, the shadows seemed to thicken, suffocating the house in darkness. Mark began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. One stormy night, as the wind howled outside, Mark was awakened by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He sat up, heart racing, and glanced at Sarah, who was deep in sleep. Gathering his courage, he tiptoed out of the bedroom and followed the sounds. The whispers grew louder as he approached the living room. "Help us, please." Mark felt a chill run down his spine, but he pressed on. As he entered the room, he saw the dark figure standing by the fireplace, its face obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" Mark demanded, his voice trembling. The figure turned, revealing a woman's face. It was Clara. "You must help us. We are trapped," she pleaded, her voice a haunting echo. "No, leave us alone," Mark shouted, stepping back in fear. Clara reached out, her hand trembling. "You don't understand. You must find the truth and set us free." The shadows swirled around her, dark and ominous, and Mark felt himself being pulled closer. Desperate, Mark ran back to the bedroom, waking Sarah in a panic. "We need to leave now," he urged, but Sarah was resolute. "No, we can't abandon Clara. We have to help her." With a heavy heart, Mark agreed to one final attempt to communicate with the spirits. They gathered in the living room again, determined to uncover the truth. As they sat in silence, the shadows thickened, wrapping around them like a shroud. "Show us the truth," Sarah called out. "We want to help." The air grew cold, and suddenly they were transported into a vision of the past. They saw Clara and her family, trapped in the house as the fire raged around them. The flames danced menacingly, consuming everything in their path. Clara's terrified screams echoed in their minds as they watched the tragedy unfold. As the vision faded, Mark and Sarah found themselves back in the living room, gasping for breath. The shadows were more agitated than ever, swirling around them in a tempest of darkness. Realizing they needed to perform a final ritual to release Clara's spirit, Sarah gathered items that represented closure: candles, a bowl of water, and Clara's journal. They set up a small altar in the living room, lighting the candles and placing the journal in front of them. "Clara, we want to help you find peace," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We're here to listen." The shadows surged, and the whispers grew louder. "Free us. We need to be free." With each passing moment, the atmosphere thickened, making it harder to breathe. Mark felt a pull toward the darkness, but he fought against it. He took Sarah's hand, grounding himself. As they began to chant, the shadows writhed and twisted, forming a vortex of darkness in the center of the room. Suddenly, Clara appeared before them, her form more solid than before. Thank you," she whispered. The shadows surged forward, trying to envelop Clara, but she held her ground. "You have the power to free us." In a moment of clarity, Sarah and Mark combined their voices, pouring their energy into the chant. The darkness recoiled, and the air crackled with energy. With one final push, they shouted, "We release you!" In an instant, the shadows dissipated, and a warm light filled the room. Clara smiled, her features softening as the darkness melted away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. With that, she vanished, leaving behind a sense of peace in the air. As the light faded, Mark and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over them. The house no longer felt heavy with dread. Instead, it felt warm and welcoming. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees outside. "We did it," Mark said, looking at Sarah with a mix of disbelief and joy. "We helped her find peace," Sarah replied, smiling through tears. They embraced, knowing they had not only freed Clara but also themselves from the shackles of fear. From that day on, the house became a home. Mark and Sarah filled it with love and laughter, embracing the memories of the past while creating their own future. The shadows had retreated, leaving behind only whispers of gratitude. When the Johnson family moved into their new home on Maplewood Lane, they thought it would be the perfect fresh start. The house was charming, with its white picket fence and blooming garden. Little did they know, the picturesque neighborhood held a dark secret. As they unpacked, strange things began to happen. Their youngest daughter, Lily, claimed to see a little girl playing in the garden at night. "She's my friend," Lily would say, her eyes sparkling with excitement. But the parents dismissed her claims, thinking it was just an imaginary friend. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, they heard a loud bang from the upstairs. "What was that?" Mr. Johnson asked, glancing at his wife. "I'll check," Mrs. Johnson said, getting up from the table. As she ascended the stairs, she felt a chill creep down her spine. The air felt heavy, as if something were watching her. Days passed, and the strange occurrences continued. Doors would open on their own and whispers echoed through the hallways. One night, Mrs. Johnson found Lily sitting on the floor in her bedroom, staring blankly at the wall. "Lily, sweetheart, what are you doing?" she asked, concerned. "The girl wants to play," Lily replied, her voice eerily calm. Mrs. Johnson felt a wave of unease wash over her. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint it. That weekend, she decided to do some research on the house's history. What she discovered left her breathless. The home had once belonged to a family who had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind a young girl named Emily. According to local lore, she had been seen wandering the neighborhood at night, searching for her lost family. One night, as Mr. Johnson was watching TV, he heard a soft voice calling his name. "Daddy! Daddy!" He turned, expecting to see Lily, but instead the room was empty. Shaking off the feeling of dread, he returned to his show. Later that evening, he decided to check on Lily. As he opened her bedroom door, he was startled to see her sitting up in bed, staring intently at the wall. "What's wrong, honey?" he asked, moving closer. "The girl was here," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" he pressed, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "She said she's lonely," Lily replied, her voice trembling. "She wants to come play." Mr. Johnson's heart raced as he tucked Lily back under the covers. "You need to forget about her. She's just a figment of your imagination." But deep down, he felt the weight of the unseen presence lingering in their home. The following week, the family began to feel the weight of the haunting more acutely. Shadows danced in the corners of their vision, and the atmosphere grew tense. One evening, Mrs. Johnson heard a soft laugh coming from the garden. She rushed outside, but found no one there. Meanwhile, Mr. Johnson was having nightmares about a little girl calling for help. He woke up in a cold sweat, feeling an oppressive force in the room. It felt as if the walls were closing in on him, suffocating him with dread. One night, as the family gathered in the living room, the lights flickered ominously. "What's going on?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. "Just a power surge," Mr. Johnson reassured her, but he didn't believe it himself. The house felt alive, and not in a good way. He decided to confront the spirit, but he had no idea how to do it. After a particularly harrowing night where Lily had screamed in terror after a nightmare, Mrs. Johnson knew they needed help. She contacted a local paranormal investigator who had experience with hauntings. When the investigator arrived, he brought equipment to measure electromagnetic fields and capture audio recordings. As he walked through the house, he began to pick up strange readings. "There's definitely a presence here," he said, his face serious. They set up in the living room and began to ask questions. "Is there someone here with us?" the investigator called out. The response was chilling, a soft whisper of a girl's voice saying, "Help me." Lily, who was sitting nearby, suddenly looked up with wide eyes. "She's sad," she said softly. The investigator turned to her. "Can you ask her what happened?" As Lily closed her eyes, the room fell silent. "She wants to find her family," she said finally, her voice trembling. "They left her behind." The investigator continued his probing, asking questions about Emily's family. As the session progressed, they learned that the girl's parents had died tragically, leaving her alone and heartbroken. They had been involved in a car accident, and the young girl had been left to wander the home, waiting for her family to return. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Mrs. Johnson felt a wave of compassion for the lost spirit. "Emily, we want to help you," she said gently. "We'll help you find your family." The room grew colder, and the shadows flickered as if acknowledging her words. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind rushed through the living room, extinguishing the candles they had lit for the seance. "Emily, please come forward," the investigator urged, trying to create a connection. As they waited in silence, a photograph fell from the mantel. It showed a happy family, and in the corner stood a girl with bright eyes and a wide smile. "That's her!" Lily shouted, pointing at the picture. That night, the family prepared a small memorial for Emily. They set up a table with flowers, a candle, and the photo of her family. "We want you to know that you are not alone anymore," Mrs. Johnson spoke softly. "We will remember you." As they lit the candle, the air felt charged with energy. They could feel Emily's presence surrounding them, and for the first time it felt warm instead of oppressive. The shadows began to retreat, revealing the true beauty of their home. Suddenly, Lily turned to her parents, her eyes wide with joy. "She's smiling," she exclaimed. The family held hands, and together, they whispered a prayer for Emily's soul to find peace. The candle flickered brightly, illuminating the room with a soft glow. With a final gust of wind, the shadows dispersed entirely, leaving behind a sense of tranquility. Emily's spirit had finally found the closure she needed. In the days that followed, the Johnsons noticed a remarkable change in their home. The atmosphere was lighter, filled with laughter and warmth. Lily often played in the garden, talking to the little girl in the picture as if she were still there. One night, as the family sat together in the living room, they heard the faint sound of laughter, a soft, joyful sound. "Is that Emily?" Mrs. Johnson wondered, smiling. "Maybe she's finally with her family," Mr. Johnson replied, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. With each passing day, the memory of Emily lingered in their hearts. But the darkness had lifted. The house on Maplewood Lane had transformed into a loving home, a sanctuary filled with cherished memories, laughter, and a spirit who was finally free. When a group of friends, Jake, Emily, Sarah, and Tom, decided to explore the abandoned Maplewood Asylum, they were thrilled at the thought of an adventure. The stories surrounding the asylum were infamous. Tales of madness and haunting spirits filled the air with mystery. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they stepped through the rusted gates, excitement and apprehension mingling in the air. As they entered the asylum, the atmosphere shifted. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the air was thick with dust. Their footsteps echoed eerily through the empty hallways. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily whispered, glancing nervously around. "Come on, don't be a chicken," Jake teased, leading the way deeper into the asylum. They passed through rooms filled with old furniture and medical equipment, relics of a forgotten time. Suddenly, Tom stumbled upon a rusted door at the end of a hallway. "Hey guys, check this out," he called, excitement in his voice. As they gathered around, they could see the words "Isolation Ward" painted in faded letters above the door. Intrigued, the friends pushed open the heavy door, which creaked ominously on its hinges. The air inside felt colder, and an uneasy silence enveloped them. The room was dimly lit by their flashlights, revealing empty cells with rusted bars. "Wow, this place is creepy," Sarah said, her voice echoing off the walls. "Can you imagine being locked up in here?" As they explored the isolation ward, they discovered disturbing remnants of the past, old patient records, restraints, and even a few personal items left behind. "This is so unsettling," Emily said, shivering at the thought of what had happened here. Jake, however, was determined to capture the perfect photo for their social media. He wandered off to get a better angle, leaving the others behind. Suddenly, he heard a soft whisper. "Help me." Startled, Jake spun around, but there was no one there. "Guys?" he called out, anxiety creeping into his voice. When he returned to his friends, they noticed his pale face. "What's wrong?" Tom asked, concern evident. "I heard something. A voice," Jake stammered. "Probably just the wind," Sarah shrugged, trying to ease the tension. But deep down, they all felt a lingering dread as they continued their exploration. They ventured into the next room where they found an old wheelchair, its fabric tattered and stained. As they examined it, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. In the darkness, they heard soft sobbing. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. Just as suddenly as it had gone out, the flashlights flickered back to life. The friends were horrified to see a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room, shrouded in darkness. "Run!" Tom shouted, and they bolted toward the exit, their hearts racing. As they reached the door, they felt a cold hand grasp Jake's shoulder. He screamed and yanked himself free, tumbling into the hallway. "What was that?" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," Jake urged, leading the way back through the asylum. As they stumbled through the dim corridors, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whispers filled the air, echoing their fears and doubts. The asylum seemed alive, its walls holding dark secrets that demanded to be heard. Once outside, the group collapsed against the gate, breathless and terrified. They couldn't believe what they had experienced. "We need to go back," Jake insisted. "We can't leave without knowing what that was." Emily shook her head. "What if it's dangerous? We barely made it out." But curiosity burned in their minds. After a heated debate, they decided to return, determined to uncover the truth. They re-entered the asylum, but this time armed with more courage and a sense of purpose. As they made their way back to the isolation ward, they felt an unseen force pulling them forward. They discovered an old journal on the floor, its pages yellowed with age. As they read, they learned about the asylum's dark history, the patients who had suffered, the experiments conducted, and the tragic fate of those who had been left behind. In the journal, they found a name: Emily Turner, a young girl who had been confined to the asylum for reasons lost to time. "We have to help her," Jake said, his voice filled with resolve. With newfound determination, the friends ventured deeper into the asylum, calling out for Emily's spirit. "We're here to help you," they shouted, echoing through the empty halls. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a figure began to materialize before them. It was a young girl with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. "Please," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody. "I can't find my family." The friends stood frozen, their hearts racing. "We'll help you," Emily said, stepping forward. "What do you need?" The spirit pointed to a door at the end of the hallway. "They're behind there," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The friends approached the door, fear gnawing at their insides. They pushed it open, revealing a dark room filled with old photographs and belongings of the patients. Among them, they found a picture of Emily with her family, smiling in happier times. As they stood in the room, the air shifted, and the spirit of the girl appeared beside them, her sadness palpable. "I want to go home," she cried, tears streaming down her translucent face. "Let us help you find peace," Jake said, his voice steady. They lit a candle and placed it in front of the photographs, forming a makeshift memorial. "You're not alone anymore." Suddenly, the atmosphere grew heavy and the whispers intensified. The shadows around them twisted and turned, trying to pull them into the darkness. "Stay strong," Sarah shouted, holding on to Emily tightly. With every ounce of courage, the friends stood firm, channeling their energy toward Emily's spirit. "You can move on," they yelled in unison. With a final gust of wind, the shadows faded, and a brilliant light enveloped the room. The spirit of Emily smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing into the light. The friends stood in silence, the weight of the asylum lifting. They felt a sense of peace wash over them, knowing they had helped a lost soul find her way home. As they left the asylum for the last time, the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the forgotten building. They knew they would never forget their experience nor the haunting beauty of the spirit they had encountered. "Let's never come back here again," Sarah said, still trembling. "Agreed," Jake replied, glancing back at the asylum one last time. "But I'm glad we did." It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway for 4 friends: Alex, Megan, Chris, and Zoe. The rustic cabin they rented deep in the woods seemed like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of their daily lives. Surrounded by towering trees, with no neighbors for miles, it promised peace and quiet. "I can't believe we got this place for so cheap," Chris exclaimed as they unloaded their bags. "Yeah, it's like something out of a fairy tale," Zoe added, admiring the cabin's old wooden charm. But as they settled in, a strange sense of unease washed over Megan. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence of the woods felt oppressive, almost unnatural. "Is it just me? Or does this place feel off?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alex laughed, brushing off her concerns. "You're just not used to being in the middle of nowhere. Relax, it's going to be fun." That evening, as the group sat around the fireplace, they heard a knock at the door. Startled, they exchanged confused glances. No one else was supposed to be out here. Alex got up and cautiously opened the door, revealing an elderly man dressed in tattered clothes. "Don't stay here tonight," the man said in a gravelly voice. "This place is cursed." "Who are you?" Alex asked, baffled. "Just someone who knows what happens to people who don't leave." "Get out while you can," the man warned, before turning and disappearing into the woods. The group laughed it off, assuming the old man was some crazy local trying to scare them. "Probably just trying to keep tourists away," Chris joked. But Megan wasn't laughing. She could feel her pulse quicken. "Maybe we should listen to him." "Come on, Megan," Zoe said, rolling her eyes. "You're being paranoid. Let's just enjoy the night." As night fell, the cabin became eerily quiet. The once comforting crackle of the fire now seemed to fill the silence in a suffocating way. Megan couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in her bed. Every time she closed her eyes, she thought she heard footsteps outside. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the front door, followed by rapid knocking. "Guys!" Megan shouted, waking everyone up. They rushed to the door, only to find no one there. "It was probably just the wind," Alex said, trying to calm everyone down. But Megan wasn't convinced. She felt a growing sense of dread, like something malevolent was lurking just outside their view. The next morning, as they prepared breakfast, Zoe noticed something strange on the window. "Hey guys, come look at this." They gathered around and saw handprints, large, muddy handprints, smeared across the outside of the window. "Okay, that's creepy," Chris admitted, his usual bravado fading. "Maybe the old man came back last night," Alex suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. Megan's anxiety skyrocketed. "We need to leave, something's not right here." Reluctantly, they agreed to check out the woods around the cabin to see if anyone had been there. As they explored, they stumbled upon something horrifying, a circle of stones with strange symbols carved into the ground. In the center was a rotting animal carcass, surrounded by dark stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "We need to leave now," Megan shouted, her voice breaking. They rushed back to the cabin, but as they packed their things, they realized the car wouldn't start. "What the hell? It was fine yesterday," Chris muttered, trying to stay calm. Panicking, Alex tried to call for help, but there was no signal. "We're trapped," he said, his voice tinged with fear. As night fell again, the strange noises began: footsteps, whispering voices, and distant howls. The knocking returned, louder this time. The friends huddled together in the living room, clutching whatever makeshift weapons they could find. "We have to survive the night," Alex said, trying to sound brave. though his hands were trembling. In the dead of night, the cabin was plunged into darkness as the lights flickered out. Suddenly, the air became freezing cold. "Did you guys feel that?" Zoe whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. The knocking intensified, but this time, it wasn't just the door. It was coming from the windows, the walls, the roof. They were surrounded. Suddenly, the door burst open, but no one was there. Just the chilling wind howling through the cabin. The group scrambled, backing away from the door when they saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest watching them. "Stay away from the windows," Megan screamed. The friends barricaded themselves in one of the bedrooms, blocking the door with furniture. They could hear the footsteps getting closer, the strange whispers now inside the cabin. Whatever it was toying with them. Suddenly, the windows shattered, and dark, shadowy figures began crawling through. They weren't human. They were twisted, faceless beings with long, gnarled limbs. "Fight them off!" Alex shouted, swinging a piece of wood at one of the creatures. But the more they fought, the more creatures appeared, swarming into the cabin. Just as they were about to be overwhelmed, Megan noticed something. The stones they had found earlier carved with symbols. "Those symbols, they're warding spells," she cried out. Desperate, Megan grabbed a piece of the broken glass and began carving the symbols into the floor. As she completed the last mark, the creatures let out an ear-piercing shriek and dissolved into smoke. The silence was deafening as the last of the shadowy figures vanished. Exhausted and shaken, the friends collapsed on the floor. By morning, the eerie stillness had returned to the woods. The car miraculously started, and the group wasted no time leaving the cursed cabin behind. As they drove away, no one spoke. But they all knew one thing: they would never return to the cabin in the woods. Mark Thompson was desperate. After losing his job and struggling with bills, he was willing to take any work he could find. That's when he saw the listing for a night shift job at a remote inn, Old Hollow Inn. The pay was surprisingly good, almost too good to turn down. It was an old, decrepit place, but Mark thought he could manage one night shift to help cover his growing expenses. The moment he arrived, a chill ran down his spine. The inn was massive, but it looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The wooden beams were cracked, the windows were grimy, and the air smelled musty. The owner, Mrs. Wilkins, was an old woman who seemed as aged as the building itself. "You'll be in charge of watching the front desk. Don't wander the halls at night, though," she warned, her eyes narrowing. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Mrs. Wilkins simply shrugged. "Old places like these hold memories. It's best not to disturb them." With that cryptic warning, she handed him the keys and disappeared into the back, leaving Mark alone in the eerie silence of the lobby. He chuckled nervously to himself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. After all, it was just an old building. What could go wrong? As the night wore on, Mark settled in at the front desk. It was quiet. Too quiet. The inn had no guests, so there wasn't much for him to do except listen to the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the lobby. Every tick seemed to echo in the empty hallways, growing louder with each passing second. Suddenly, a faint sound caught his attention. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. Mark froze. Mrs. Wilkins had been clear that there were no other employees, and the inn was supposedly empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. No answer. The footsteps continued, heavier now, moving closer. Mark's heart raced as he grabbed the flashlight from the desk and started up the staircase. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and the dim light barely illuminated the long, shadowy hall ahead. As he reached the top, the footsteps stopped. Mark swept the beam of his flashlight across the corridor, but there was nothing. Just empty rooms and silence. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding before shaking his head. "Must be the building settling," he muttered to himself, and turned to go back downstairs. But as he did, a cold gust of wind blew past him, and a voice, barely more than a whisper, said, "You shouldn't be here." Mark spun around, but again, there was no one there. The next morning, Mark couldn't shake the strange feeling from the night before. He decided to ask Mrs. Wilkins about the inn's history, hoping to put his mind at ease. Over a cup of tea, Mrs. Wilkins told him the grim tale of Old Hollow Inn. This place was once a bustling inn, back in the early 1900s. But after a tragic fire killed several guests, the place was never the same. People say the spirits of those who died that night still linger, unable to move on. She explained, her voice low and somber. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Mrs. Wilkins smiled faintly. "I don't need to believe. I've seen them." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Mark felt the weight of the building's dark history pressing down on him. But he was no quitter. He needed this job, and he wasn't going to let some old ghost story scare him off. That night, Mark tried to keep his focus on his duties, but the memory of the footsteps and the whisper lingered in his mind. As the hours dragged on, the inn once again seemed to come alive with strange noises, soft whispers, distant creaks, and faint footsteps echoing through the halls. Around midnight, Mark decided to take a quick walk around the inn, hoping to reassure himself that nothing was out of the ordinary. As he made his way through the dimly lit corridors, he heard a sound, like someone breathing, soft and steady, coming from one of the rooms. Cautiously, he approached the door. It was slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, the beam of his flashlight fell on a figure standing by the window. A woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her back to him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Ma'am, are you lost?" The woman didn't move. Slowly, Mark took a step closer, but as he did, the woman vanished into thin air. His heart racing, Mark stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He had just seen a ghost. There was no other explanation. He bolted out of the room and back to the front desk, his hands trembling. That night, Mark tried to keep his focus on his duties, but the memory of the footsteps and the whisper lingered in his mind. As the hours dragged on, the inn once again seemed to come alive with strange noises, soft whispers, distant creaks, and faint footsteps echoing through the halls. Around midnight, Mark decided to take a quick walk around the inn, hoping to reassure himself that nothing was out of the ordinary. As he made his way through the dimly lit corridors, he heard a sound, like someone breathing, soft and steady, coming from one of the rooms. Cautiously, he approached the door. It was slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, the beam of his flashlight fell on a figure standing by the window, a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her back to him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Ma'am, are you lost?" The woman didn't move. Slowly, Mark took a step closer, but as he did, the woman vanished into thin air. His heart racing, Mark stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He had just seen a ghost. There was no other explanation. He bolted out of the room and back to the front desk, his hands trembling. The next day, Mark confronted Mrs. Wilkins. "There's something here, isn't there? I saw her, a woman, in one of the rooms." Mrs. Wilkins looked at him with sad eyes. "That would be Emily. She was one of the guests who died in the fire. She's been seen before." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I warned you not to wander the halls at night," she said softly. "Emily isn't dangerous, but there are others. They're not so kind." Mark felt a wave of dread wash over him. "What do you mean?" "There's something else here," Mrs. Wilkins whispered. "Something dark. It feeds on fear. It's been here long before the fire, and it's not trapped like the others. It moves freely." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had only been working here for a few days, but it was clear that Old Hollow Inn was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. That night, Mark was on edge. Every creak, every whisper set his nerves on fire. He kept to the front desk, refusing to venture into the halls again. But as the clock struck midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the inn. Mark stood frozen, his breath visible in the freezing air. The growling grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and move on their own. The front door flew open with a violent crash, and standing in the doorway was a tall, shadowy figure, its eyes glowing a deep, malevolent red. Mark's body went cold with fear as the figure stepped toward him, its growl filling the room. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. Just as the creature reached out for him, Mark remembered Mrs. Wilkins' warning about the fear. Summoning every ounce of courage, he faced the creature head-on. "I'm not afraid of you," he shouted, his voice trembling but strong. For a moment, the creature hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving the room in an eerie silence. The next morning, Mark quit his job. He couldn't stay another night in that cursed place. As he packed his things, Mrs. Wilkins gave him a knowing nod. "You survived. Not many do." Mark didn't respond. He was just grateful to be leaving Old Hollow Inn behind. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The inn may have let him go, but he knew its dark presence would haunt him forever. Lena and her husband James had always dreamed of owning a home of their own, and after years of saving, they finally found the perfect place. It was an old, charming house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and steeped in history. Despite its age, it had been well maintained, and Lena fell in love with the cozy atmosphere and beautiful garden. "This is it," she whispered to James as they stood in front of the house. "This is where we're supposed to be." The move-in day was filled with excitement and joy. They unpacked boxes, set up their furniture, and shared a celebratory dinner on the porch as the sun set. Everything felt perfect, like they were finally starting the life they had always dreamed of. But that night, as Lena lay in bed, she began to notice something odd. The house, which had felt warm and welcoming during the day, seemed to change after dark. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, and the house made strange, creaking noises. She told herself it was just the house settling, but a strange feeling of unease lingered in her chest. James was already fast asleep, so Lena decided to ignore the creeping anxiety and closed her eyes. However, just as she was about to drift off, she heard a soft whisper, a voice, barely audible, calling her name. "Lena." She sat up, her heart pounding. "James?" she whispered, but her husband didn't stir. The whisper came again, this time from the hallway. "Lena." The next day, Lena brushed off the strange experience, convincing herself it was just her imagination. After all, it had been a stressful week, and she was probably overtired. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. Every night, without fail, Lena would hear the whisper. Sometimes it was calling her name, other times it was just unintelligible murmuring, like someone speaking just out of earshot. The shadows in the house seemed to move on their own, flickering in the corners of her vision. One evening, as she was cleaning the living room, Lena noticed something even stranger: handprints on the walls. At first, she thought they might have been left by James or herself while they were moving furniture. But the prints were small, like those of a child. She tried to clean them off, but no matter how hard she scrubbed, the marks wouldn't disappear. Her unease grew, and she began to feel watched, as if unseen eyes were following her every move. Even James, who had initially dismissed her concerns, began to notice the odd happenings. "Maybe it's just the old pipes," James suggested one night as they lay in bed. "This house has been around for a while. Old houses make noise." But deep down, Lena knew it was something more. A few weeks later, Lena and James decided to host a small housewarming party, inviting their close friends and family. It was a chance to show off their beautiful new home and maybe shake off the growing tension they had been feeling. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere was light and cheerful. Laughter filled the rooms, and for the first time in weeks, Lena felt a sense of normalcy. But as the night drew to a close and the last guests began to leave, Lena noticed something disturbing. One of her friends, Sarah, had gone pale and seemed visibly shaken. "Are you okay?" Lena asked, concerned. Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Lena, I don't want to scare you, but I saw something upstairs. I went to use the bathroom, and when I came out, there was a little girl standing at the end of the hall. But when I called out to her, she just disappeared." Lena felt her blood run cold. "A little girl?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded. "I don't know. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt so real." That night, after everyone had left, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Who was the little girl Sarah had seen? Was she the same presence Lena had felt in the house? As if in response to her thoughts, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Lena." The next day, Lena decided to do some research on the history of their house. She went to the local library and began searching through old records and newspaper articles. What she found sent chills down her spine. Decades ago, the house had belonged to a family with 2 young children, a boy and a girl. Tragedy had struck when the little girl, Emily, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Despite a lengthy investigation, she was never found, and her disappearance had remained an unsolved mystery. Lena's heart pounded as she read the details. Could the little girl Sarah had seen be Emily? Was her spirit still trapped in the house, searching for something or someone? When she told James about her findings, he was skeptical. "You really think a ghost is haunting our house?" "I don't know, James," Lena replied, her voice trembling. "But something is here. I can feel it." As the strange occurrences continued to escalate, Lena began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just the whispering or the moving shadows anymore. There was something darker in the house, something malevolent. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Lena fumbled for her phone, using the flashlight to find her way. As she made her way down the hallway, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate footsteps. She turned around, shining the light down the hall, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped, but the air around her felt heavy, oppressive, like something was watching her. Suddenly, the whisper came again, but this time it wasn't soft or distant. It was right behind her. "Lena." She spun around, her heart pounding, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, forming into a dark, human-like shape. The shape moved toward her and Lena screamed, running back into the bedroom and slamming the door behind her. Lena knew she couldn't live in fear anymore. Whatever was in the house, it wasn't going to leave them alone. She decided to contact a paranormal investigator, hoping they could help her figure out what was going on. The investigator, a woman named Claire, arrived the next day. She walked through the house with a serious expression, her eyes scanning every room as if she could sense the energy in the air. "This house has a very dark history," Claire said after her initial walkthrough. "I can feel multiple presences here, but there's one that stands out. It's angry, and it's been here for a long time." Lena's stomach churned. "What do we do?" "We need to communicate with it," Claire said. "Find out what it wants." That night, Claire set up her equipment in the living room. As the session began, the temperature in the room dropped, and the air felt thick with tension. Claire called out to the spirits, asking them to make themselves known. At first, there was silence. Then, the whisper came again, clear as day. "Lena." Lena's heart raced and she glanced at Claire, who remained calm. "What do you want?" Claire asked the entity. For a moment, there was no response. Then the shadows in the room began to move, forming into the dark, twisted shape Lena had seen before. "Leave," the voice growled, its tone deep and menacing. "This is my house." Realizing the situation was far more dangerous than she had anticipated, Claire urged Lena and James to leave the house immediately. "This spirit won't rest until it's driven you out," she warned. "It's feeding off your fear." Lena and James didn't need any more convincing. They packed their bags and left the house that night, abandoning the dream home they had worked so hard for. As they drove away, Lena glanced back at the house. In the window, she saw the silhouette of a little girl standing silently, watching them leave. But standing behind her was the dark figure, its red eyes glowing with malice. They never returned to Old Hollow Inn. Emily and her husband Michael had been searching for the perfect home for years. When they came across Maplewood Mansion, a grand old estate nestled in the countryside, they couldn't believe their luck. The house was enormous, with towering ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a sprawling garden that stretched into the woods beyond. It had been abandoned for years, but the price was too good to pass up. "This is it," Emily said, staring at the mansion in awe. "This is where we're going to start our family." Michael smiled, nodding in agreement. The house had a sense of history, and despite its eerie, weathered appearance, it felt like home. They moved in a few weeks later, excited to begin their new life in the peaceful countryside. But from the moment they set foot inside, Emily felt something was off. The house, though beautiful, had an oppressive atmosphere, as if it were holding onto the memories of its dark past. There was a chill in the air, even in the middle of summer, and strange noises echoed through the empty halls at night. Whispers, footsteps, doors creaking open on their own. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the house settling after years of neglect. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. As the weeks passed, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. At first, it was small things: furniture moving on its own, cold drafts in rooms with no windows open, and the distinct feeling of being watched. Emily often found herself glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but the halls were always empty. Michael was skeptical. "It's just an old house, Em," he said whenever she brought it up. "Things creak and groan. It's nothing to worry about." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling of dread that seemed to seep from the walls of the mansion. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a loud crash from downstairs. She rushed down, expecting to find something had fallen, but everything was in its place, except for a single chair, which had been moved to the center of the room facing the doorway. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed out of the room. She told herself it must have been Michael, though deep down, she knew he had already gone to bed. The next morning, when she mentioned the chair to Michael, he just shrugged it off. "Maybe it was the wind," he said with a laugh. But there was no wind that night. Emily's curiosity got the better of her, and she began to research the history of Maplewood Mansion. What she found was far more disturbing than she had anticipated. The mansion had been built in the early 1900s by a wealthy family, the Hartleys. The father, Henry Hartley, was a prominent businessman, known for his ruthless nature and suspicious dealings. The family had lived in the mansion for decades, but tragedy struck when Henry's wife, Clara, and their 2 children were found dead under mysterious circumstances. No one had ever been charged, and rumors spread that Henry was responsible for their deaths. After the family's demise, the mansion was abandoned. Over the years, it had been passed from one owner to the next, each family leaving under strange circumstances. Some claimed to have seen the ghost of Clara Hartley wandering the halls, while others reported hearing the laughter of children echoing through the house at night. Emily's blood ran cold as she read the accounts. Could the spirits of the Hartley family still be lingering in the mansion, trapped by the violence and tragedy of their past? The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and growing unease. The noises in the mansion became more frequent, and Emily began to hear the distinct sound of children's laughter. Soft at first, then louder, echoing through the halls late at night. One evening, as Emily was preparing dinner, she heard the sound of footsteps running down the hallway. Thinking it was Michael, she called out, "Michael, are you home?" There was no answer. She stepped into the hallway, only to find it empty. But the sound of footsteps continued running past her and up the stairs. Emily's heart raced, and she hurried after the sound, stopping at the top of the stairs. The hallway was dark, but she could still hear the faint sound of laughter, as if children were playing hide-and-seek just out of sight. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, in the darkness at the end of the hall, she saw the faint outline of a child, a little girl standing still watching her. Emily gasped, blinking in disbelief, and when she looked again, the girl was gone. Emily knew she couldn't ignore the haunting any longer. She reached out to a local historian who specialized in paranormal activity, hoping to find answers. The historian, a woman named Margaret, agreed to meet Emily at the mansion the following week. When Margaret arrived, she immediately sensed the oppressive energy in the house. "There is something very wrong here," she said as they walked through the halls. "I can feel the presence of many spirits, but there is one that stands out. It's angry." Emily's stomach churned with fear. "What do we do?" Margaret looked around, her expression grim. "We need to find out what it wants." That night, Margaret conducted a séance in the living room, hoping to make contact with the spirits. As the candles flickered and the air grew colder, Margaret called out to the spirits of the house, asking them to reveal themselves. At first, there was nothing. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room, followed by the faint laughter of children. The temperature dropped, and Emily felt a cold breeze brush past her, sending chills down her spine. Suddenly, a deep, menacing voice filled the room. "Leave," it growled. "You are not welcome here." Emily's heart raced as the shadows in the room seemed to twist and move on their own. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Leave, or you will suffer." Despite the warning, Emily and Michael decided to stay. They had invested everything into the mansion, and they couldn't bring themselves to leave. But the hauntings only grew worse. The children's laughter turned into cries of anguish, and the footsteps that once seemed playful now felt ominous, as if something was hunting them. One night, as Emily lay in bed, she felt a heavy weight pressed down on her chest. She opened her eyes and saw the shadowy figure of a man standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes glowing with anger. "Leave," the figure growled, its voice echoing in the room. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The pressure on her chest grew unbearable, and she gasped for breath. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the figure vanished and the weight lifted. Shaking, she woke Michael, who had slept through the entire ordeal. "We need to leave," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We can't stay here." But before they could make plans to leave, the hauntings escalated to a terrifying level. Doors slammed shut on their own, windows shattered without warning, and the once beautiful garden outside withered and died. The spirits of the house were making it clear they were not welcome.